She is standing at a podium in Washington, D.C., in the autumn of 1942. The room is full of journalists, American journalists, mostly men who cover politics and press conferences and the managed distance of a war being fought on other continents. They have questions prepared. They look at the young woman at the podium, 26 years old, small, dark-haired, wearing a Soviet military uniform, and they ask the questions they have prepared. One asks whether she finds it difficult to wear such a masculine uniform. Another asks whether Soviet women are permitted to use makeup at the front. A third asks whether she would consider switching to a more feminine style of cap. She listens to the questions. She is fluent in these situations now, has learned, over the months of her American tour, to calibrate her patience against the particular variety of condescension being directed at her. She has been through Odessa. She has been through the siege of Sevastopol. She has faced German snipers in the rubble of 2 cities and outlasted them. She has 309 confirmed kills, the highest count of any female sniper in the history of warfare, a number that the journalists asking about her cap seem not to have fully absorbed. She waits for a pause. Then she says, simply and without apparent heat, "Gentlemen, I am 26 years old. I have already destroyed 309 fascist occupants. Do you not think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The room goes quiet. This is the story of how she got there. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was born in 1916 in Biela Tserkva, a city in what is now central Ukraine. She was, from early on, someone who found conventional expectations chafing. She was athletic, competitive, and interested in things that were not, in the Soviet Union of the 1930s, conventionally female, though the Soviet state, it should be said, was considerably more open to unconventional women than most of the world at that time. She began marksmanship training as a teenager at a local shooting club and discovered quickly that she was exceptionally good at it. There is a quality that the best marksmen share, a capacity for absolute stillness at the moment of action, a kind of internal quiet that allows everything else to be shut out, and Pavlichenko had it. She pursued it seriously. She earned qualifications, competed, improved. She was also a student. She enrolled at Kiev University to study history, had a son young in a brief marriage, and was working toward a degree when the war arrived. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. The Eastern Front opened across a distance that dwarfed anything the war had seen in the West, and the violence that accompanied it, the sheer industrial scale of destruction on both sides, was of a different order from what Western Europe had experienced. Pavlichenko went to a recruitment office and asked to enlist as a combat soldier. The recruiter suggested she might be more useful as a nurse. She said she wanted a rifle. She was 24 years old, and she knew how to use one. The army, looking at her marksmanship qualifications, eventually agreed. She was assigned to the 25th Rifle Division of the Red Army as a sniper and deployed to the fighting around Odessa, on the Black Sea coast, in August 1941. Odessa in the summer and autumn of 1941 was under siege by Romanian and German forces. The city held out for 73 days, a defense that became one of the early symbols of Soviet resistance, and that cost both sides enormously. Pavlichenko operated as a sniper throughout the Odessa defense. Sniper work is different from other forms of combat in ways that are easy to describe but difficult to inhabit. It is solitary work, often conducted at extreme ranges, over periods of many hours. The sniper must find and hold a firing position without being detected, must remain still, sometimes without food or water, sometimes through weather that makes stillness additionally punishing, and must wait for the precise moment that justifies everything that has come before. It is also work that requires a particular relationship with the act of killing, a willingness to make it deliberate, individual, and direct in a way that the organized chaos of infantry combat does not demand. Many soldiers who function perfectly well in firefights find they cannot do this kind of work. The separation between the aim and the trigger, filled with silence, is harder to cross than it appears. Pavlichenko crossed it. She accumulated kills in Odessa, and she also, crucially, accumulated experience in something that is often overlooked in accounts of sniper warfare: counter-sniper work. The most dangerous opponents she faced were German and Romanian snipers, experienced and patient, who were also hunting her. These engagements sometimes lasted hours, Two people in concealed positions, each waiting for the other to move, each knowing that the first to move would die. She won these engagements. The counter-sniper engagements deserve particular attention because they reveal something important about what she actually was. She was not simply a marksman, a person who could hit a target at distance. She was a hunter, in the complete sense of the word. Someone who could read terrain, understand how another predator would think, predict behavior from evidence, and use patience as a weapon. When a German sniper was operating in the rubble of Odessa, she studied the pattern of his shots, identified his likely positions, and placed herself where she could wait for him to move. The patience required for this, hours of absolute stillness, in heat, in discomfort, knowing that she was also being hunted, is not a skill that training creates from nothing. It comes from something prior. By the time Odessa fell in October 1941 and the 25th Division was evacuated by sea, she had 187 confirmed kills. She was assigned to Sevastopol. Sevastopol was worse. The siege of Sevastopol lasted from October 1941 to July 1942. 8 months of continuous combat in a city being systematically destroyed around its defenders. Pavlichenko operated throughout, living in the rubble, moving between positions, continuing the patient deadly work she had refined at Odessa. She was wounded 4 times. None of the wounds were severe enough to remove her from the line for long. She came back each time and continued. This is worth sitting with for a moment because the history of warfare is full of accounts of soldiers who returned to battle after wounds, and what it tells you is not just about physical toughness. It is about the particular attachment to the work and to the people alongside you that makes the alternative sitting out feel impossible. Pavlichenko, in her memoirs, does not dramatize these returns. She describes coming back the way she describes everything, as what needed to be done next. During the Sevastopol siege, she engaged in a series of countersniper operations against German specialists. Men who had been sent specifically because the Soviet female sniper operating in the ruins was becoming a problem for German troop morale and officer safety. She killed 36 enemy snipers during her career. This particular number is considered by military historians to be the more significant statistic, because it indicates not just marksmanship but the ability to win the most demanding and most dangerous form of the craft against its most skilled practitioners. By the time she was finally evacuated from Sevastopol, wounded again, ordered out by command that could not afford to lose her, both as a soldier and as the propaganda asset she had become, her confirmed kill count stood at 309. The Soviet military stopped counting at that point. She was taken out of combat. She was 25 years old. In August 1942, Pavlichenko arrived in the United States as part of a Soviet delegation attending the International Student Assembly at the White House. She was the first Soviet citizen to be officially received by an American president during the war. Franklin Roosevelt met with her. Eleanor Roosevelt was her host. The relationship that developed between Eleanor Roosevelt and Lyudmila Pavlichenko was, by any measure, unlikely. Eleanor was 61 and one of the most powerful women in America, a figure of immense political sophistication who had navigated decades of Washington's particular cruelties. Pavlichenko was 26, spoke limited English, and had spent the last year in the rubble of cities under siege. They liked each other enormously. Eleanor invited her to Hyde Park, the Roosevelt family estate, where Pavlichenko stayed for several days. They talked through interpreters about the war, about women, about what the world might look like afterward. Eleanor later described her as one of the most impressive people she had met during the war, a woman of unusual moral clarity and personal force. There is a photograph from this visit. Pavlichenko in her uniform, Eleanor in her customary print dress, the two of them standing in the garden at Hyde Park, talking to each other with the ease that sometimes develops between people who have both, in their different ways, faced things that most people have not. The photograph captures something that the official record misses. They were genuinely comfortable together. Eleanor would advocate publicly for Pavlichenko's cause, the cause being, essentially, the opening of a second front in Europe that would relieve pressure on the Soviet Union. This was what Pavlichenko had been sent to argue for, and she argued for it with the only credential that actually mattered in 1942. She had been there, and she could tell you what it cost. Pavlichenko's tour of the United States included visits to major cities, addresses to crowds, and the press conferences that have become the most quoted episodes of her public life. She was not a natural public speaker. She was a sniper, a student, a person whose work had been defined by silence and patience. But she was honest in a way that American audiences found either startling or thrilling depending on their inclination. When a journalist asked her what she thought of American women, she said she thought they should be fighting. When asked if she was afraid of death, she said she was not afraid of the death of fascists. When the man asked about her cap, she said what she said, and the room went quiet and she had made her point. She traveled to Canada and Britain before returning to the Soviet Union. She was awarded the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military decoration in the country, and assigned to train new snipers, a role that drew on everything she had learned at the cost of everything she had endured. She trained hundreds of snipers for the remainder of the war. Whether this was harder than the combat she had been removed from is something she never said publicly. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in 1974 at the age of 58. She had lived the post-war decades in relative quiet, working as a historian, giving occasional interviews, watching the world she had fought to preserve become the world she lived in. Her memoirs, published posthumously and translated into English, have a quality that is easy to undervalue. They are honest. She does not sentimentalize what she did, and she does not apologize for it. She went to war. She fought effectively. She came home. She continued. In Chicago, during her 1942 tour, Woody Guthrie was so moved by her story that he wrote a song. The chorus goes, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's name rings out. More than 300 Nazis she cut out. It is not a great song. It is a true one. What remains, underneath the numbers and the anecdotes and the photograph of her standing at that podium in Washington, is something harder to quantify than a kill count. It is the image of a person who looked at an impossible situation, a war of extermination being fought against her country, a world that could not quite accommodate what she was, and simply refused to accept any of the limitations being imposed on her. Not loudly, not with performance, with patience and precision, which had always been her gifts. The man who asked about her cap did not know who he was talking to. He found out. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week. What kind of person, knowing that everyone around her has been arrested, chooses to stay? Not because they have no choice. Not because their escape route is cut. She is offered extraction. She is told that her network has been rolled up, that the Gestapo has names, that to remain is almost certainly to die. She has a way out. She knows it. And she says no. Try to understand what that answer means. Paris, the summer of 1943. German soldiers at every checkpoint. The apartment where she sleeps must be changed every few nights. The radio she carries, the radio that is the reason she exists here, the thread connecting the French resistance to London, weighs 30 pounds and makes her a target every time she moves it. The Gestapo has detector vans cruising the streets, triangulating broadcasts. She knows all of this. She stays anyway. Her name was Noor Inayat Khan. She was 29 years old. She was the last wireless operator standing in occupied Paris, and she had decided that leaving would mean that London went dark, and that was something she would not allow. To understand Noor Inayat Khan, you have to begin far from Paris and far from Europe. She was born in Moscow in 1914, the eldest child of Hazrat Inayat Khan, a Sufi mystic and musician who had brought the teachings of the Chishti order from India to the West, and who was himself a descendant of Tipu Sultan, the 18th century ruler of Mysore who had fought the British to the last and died defending his city rather than surrender. That ancestry mattered. It was not something Noor wore as decoration. It was something she had absorbed, gradually, through a childhood spent in a household where music and philosophy and the obligations of conscience were as present as bread. Her father died when she was 13. The family, her mother, an American woman named Ora Ray Baker, and 4 children, moved to Paris, to a house in Churchill on a hill above the Seine. Noor grew up bilingual in French and English, studied child psychology at the Sorbonne, wrote children's stories for radio broadcasts and magazines. She was gentle, musical, thoughtful. People who knew her described someone who could not bear to see any living creature suffer, who asked questions others did not think to ask, who had a quality of attention that made whoever she was speaking with feel genuinely seen. She was not an obvious candidate for clandestine warfare. When the Germans occupied France in June 1940, Noor and her family escaped to England. She could have remained safe there. She could have continued her writing, supported the war effort in any number of ways that did not involve personal danger. Instead, she enlisted in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and trained as a wireless operator, the person who sends and receives coded messages, the communications backbone of any covert network. She was good at it. More than good. In 1942, she was recruited by the Special Operations Executive. What drew the SOE to her was what had drawn her to the wireless. She was quiet, technically skilled, and possessed of a capacity for focused concentration under pressure. She also spoke perfect French with a Parisian accent. She had grown up in Churchill, after all. In occupied France, accent was the difference between passing a checkpoint and not passing it. The SOE needed people who sounded like they belonged, nor sounded like she had never left. She trained through the autumn of 1942 and into 1943 fieldcraft, communications security, cover story construction, the 1,000 small practical disciplines that separated agents who survived from agents who did not. The training was demanding and the washout rate was high. She completed it. She was given a cover name, Jean-Marie Renier, and a field code name, Madeline. The Special Operations Executive was Churchill's answer to occupied Europe, an organization tasked with subversion, sabotage, and the support of local resistance movements. Its French section, F section, ran agents into occupied France, and the most dangerous of those agents were the wireless operators. They were the most exposed. They were the most hunted. A wireless operator's job was to transmit coded messages from the field back to London intelligence, requests for supply drops, coordination with local resistance groups. Each transmission had to be short, because the Gestapo's detector vans could triangulate a signal in 20 minutes. Operators were told to keep broadcasts under 15 minutes. They were told to change location frequently. They were told that their life expectancy in the field, statistically, was 6 weeks. Noor's SOE assessment reports are still in the National Archives, and they make for complicated reading. Her evaluators were uncertain about her. She had excellent technical skills, genuine dedication, and courage that was clearly real. But they worried about her emotional sensitivity, whether it would compromise her ability to maintain the psychological distance the work required. One report described her as not overburdened with brains. Another called her a splendid, vague, dreamy creature, far too emotional. These assessments look very different in hindsight. She was deployed to France in June 1943 under the field name Madeline, as the wireless operator for the Prosper Network, one of the largest resistance networks in Paris. She had been in the field less than a month when the network collapsed. The Prosper disaster was one of the worst intelligence catastrophes of the SOE's existence. In the summer of 1943, the network was rolled up with devastating speed. Its leader was arrested. Then another agent. Then another. Within weeks, dozens of people, French resistance fighters, couriers, safe housekeepers, had been taken by the Gestapo. The arrests cascaded through the network like a fault line opening. London knew it was bad. They contacted Madeline and offered to bring her home. She refused. She told London that she was the last operator still free in Paris. If she left, the city would go dark. The resistance cells still operating would have no way to communicate with London, no way to call in supply drops, no way to coordinate. She could still function. She would stay. What followed were 4 months that are almost impossible to imagine from the outside. She moved constantly, changing safe houses every few nights, carrying the 30-pound radio transmitter in a suitcase that she had to manhandle onto trains and through checkpoints. She was known to the Gestapo. They had descriptions of her from captured agents, though not yet her location. The detector vans were a constant threat. She continued to transmit. She was the last link between Paris and London. For 4 months, she held that link open. During this period, she was approached twice by Germans or collaborators who tried to expose her. She evaded them. She changed her appearance when she could. She did the work that kept her alive by necessity and kept her in Paris by choice. She was also lonely in a way that the bare facts do not capture. The people she had known in the network were gone, dead, arrested, or in hiding and unreachable. She was operating alone in a city where any conversation might be her last, maintaining a discipline and a composure that her original evaluators had doubted she possessed. Think about what it meant practically to do what she was doing. She had to schedule and conduct transmissions, each one short, each one from a different location, each one risking the detector vans that were cruising the arrondissements in search of illegal broadcasts. She had to encode her messages by hand, using the cipher systems she had been taught, and decode the replies from London with the same painstaking care. She had to find new safe houses, apartments of people willing to risk everything to shelter a woman with a radio, and she had to assess those people's reliability without the luxury of long acquaintance. She had to eat and sleep and move through the city. She had to not be noticed. Every day for 4 months. One account from this period records that she was spotted by a German officer on the Paris metro who recognized her from a description, and that she talked her way out of the situation by inventing a cover story on the spot, calmly and fluently, and then changed safe houses that night. Whether this particular incident can be verified is uncertain. That she was capable of it is not. The 4 months themselves are the verification. Then, in October 1943, she was betrayed. The identity of her betrayer has been debated for decades. The most likely candidate was a woman named Renée Gary, the sister of one of Noor's fellow agents, who was apparently motivated by a personal grievance and received the equivalent of 100,000 francs from the Gestapo. She gave them the address. The Gestapo arrived at Noor's current safe house at the end of October 1943. She attempted to escape through a window. She was caught. Even in capture, she did not make things easy for them. She attempted to escape from their headquarters 3 times. The third attempt, she nearly made it, got as far as the roof before she was caught. After the third escape attempt, she was designated highly dangerous and transferred to Germany under special security classification. At her Gestapo interrogation, she gave them her name and nothing else. Despite prolonged questioning, she did not give them a single name, a single safe house, a single address that could be used against the network still functioning. They did not break her. She was imprisoned first in Germany at Pforzheim, in conditions that the post-war War Crimes Commission would describe as exceptionally harsh, solitary confinement, chained with almost no human contact for 10 months. Her guards later testified that she never gave up information and never stopped attempting to communicate with other prisoners. One guard recalled that she managed to scratch messages in the wooden surfaces of her cell, attempting to leave some record, some trace, something that said she had been there and had not given in. The 10 months at Pforzheim are among the hardest portions of this story to contemplate. The resistance cells she had kept alive through her transmissions continued their work. The Allied armies that she had helped supply with intelligence were advancing across France and into Germany. The liberation she had stayed to serve was coming. She did not know how close it was, and she could not reach it. In September 1944, she and 3 other SOE women, Yolanda Beekman, Madeleine Damerment, and Elaine Pluman, were transferred to Dachau concentration camp. They were executed on the morning of September 13, 1944. They were made to kneel. They were shot. According to a witness account that emerged after the war, Noor Inayat Khan's last word before the shot was fired was a single word in French, liberté. Whether this is precisely true or has passed through the distortions that all accounts acquire in the telling, it is true enough. It is true to who she was and what she had chosen. She had gone back to French soil to fight for liberation. She had stayed when staying was near certain death. Whatever she said or did not say at the end, the arc of her choices speaks clearly enough. Noor Inayat Khan was awarded the George Cross posthumously in 1949, the highest civilian decoration in the British Commonwealth, awarded for acts of the greatest heroism or for most conspicuous courage in circumstances of extreme danger. She was also awarded the Croix de Guerre by France. There is a bust of her in Gordon Square, London, unveiled in 2012. There is a plaque in Schuresens, where she grew up, outside the house her family lived in. Her personnel file in the National Archives runs to hundreds of pages. But the thing that endures beyond the medals and the commemorations is the decision itself. The moment when she was offered the exit and she said no. Most people, told that their situation is hopeless, accept the evidence of that hopelessness. Noor Inayat Khan looked at the same evidence and reached a different conclusion. That as long as she could still transmit, something was still possible. That the darkness was not total while she remained. She was wrong about her own survival. She was right about everything else. The children's stories she wrote before the war were called 20 Jataka tales, stories drawn from the Buddhist tradition, about compassion and sacrifice and the obligation to alleviate suffering wherever you find it. She had been shaped by that tradition, and by her Sufi upbringing, and by the memory of an ancestor who had died rather than submit to something he found intolerable. In the end, she was exactly who she had always been. The war did not make her brave. It only made her bravery visible. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week. In February of 1940, on the Kala front in eastern Finland, a Soviet sniper is scanning a tree line through his scope. He has been sent here specifically to kill one man. He is one of several. The Red Army has dispatched countersniper teams, artillery batteries, and, on at least one occasion, an entire infantry platoon to eliminate a single Finnish soldier who has been killing their men from the forest for 3 months. The Soviet sniper is good. He is patient. He has been in position since before dawn, lying on a white sheet spread over the snow, waiting for movement among the trees 300 meters to his north. He sees nothing. The forest is still. The temperature is -40 degrees Celsius. The air is so cold that breathing through his nose leaves frost on his eyelashes. He does not see the small mound of snow 60 meters to his left that was not there yesterday. The mound shifts. A rifle fires once. The Soviet sniper falls. The mound is a man. A small man, 5 feet 3 inches tall. Lying in a trench he dug himself and packed with snow until only the barrel of his rifle and the top of his white hood are visible. He is wearing a white camouflage suit over a Finnish army uniform. He is not using a telescopic sight. He uses only the iron sights that came with his rifle, because a scope produces a glint in sunlight that can give away a position, and this man does not give away positions. His name is Simo Häyhä. He is a farmer from Rotjärvi, a village near the Soviet border. He is 34 years old, and in the 98 days between the 30th of November 1939 and the 6th of March 1940, he will kill more than 500 enemy soldiers, the highest confirmed sniper count in the history of warfare. The Soviets call him Deadliest Smrt, the White Death. Simo Häyhä was born on the 17th of December, 1905, in the municipality of Rotjärvi, in the Karelian Isthmus, a strip of land between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland that had been part of the Russian Empire until Finnish independence in 1917. His family were farmers. They grew crops in the brief Finnish summer and hunted in the long Finnish winter. The land was flat, forested, cold and quiet, and Simo grew up in it the way a fox grows up in its territory, knowing every tree, every slope, every frozen stream. He was the 7th of 8 children. He was small. He would never grow past 5 feet 3. He was also, from childhood, an uncommonly good shot. Hunting was not recreation in Rotjärvi. It was how you ate. Simo learned to shoot the way he learned to walk, early by necessity, and with a precision that was not discussed because it was not unusual. In rural Finland, boys who could not shoot straight went hungry. At 17, he joined the Suojalaskunta, the Finnish Civil Guard, a voluntary militia that served as the country's reserve defense force. He trained seriously. He competed in local shooting matches. He won most of them. By his late 20s, he was considered one of the best marksmen in his district, which, in a district full of hunters, was not a distinction anyone gave lightly. He was a quiet man. Neighbors described him as private, polite, and brief. He did not drink. He did not tell stories. He farmed. He hunted. He read. He was 34 years old when the Soviet Union invaded Finland on the 30th of November, 1939. The Winter War began without a declaration. Stalin wanted the Karelian Isthmus as a buffer for Leningrad. Finland refused to cede it. The Red Army crossed the border with 21 divisions, roughly 450,000 men, against a Finnish army of 300,000, many of them reservists and farmers carrying their own rifles. Simo Häyhä was mobilized with the 6th Company of the 34th Infantry Regiment, Javelin Group, and sent to the Kala River sector. Kala was one of the critical points of the Finnish defensive line. The terrain was dense forest, broken by frozen bogs and low ridges. The temperature, that first winter, rarely rose above -20. On many days it was -40 or colder. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Metal burns to the touch. Rifle oil thickens. Breath crystallizes into a visible cloud that can betray a man's position from 200 meters away. Simo adapted to these conditions the way he had adapted to every winter of his life. Methodically, without complaint, as if the cold were simply another fact of the landscape that had to be accounted for. He chose his weapon carefully. He carried a Finnish-made Seiko M2830, a variant of the Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifle, rechambered and rebarreled by the Finns, widely considered one of the most accurate infantry rifles of its era. He did not use a scope. This was not stubbornness or superstition. It was calculation. A telescopic sight, in the conditions at Kala, presented three problems. First, it required the shooter to raise his head higher above cover to align his eye with the optic, an additional few centimeters that, against a countersniper, could be fatal. Second, the glass surface caught light, even the weak winter light of a Finnish December, and produced a glint visible at distance. Third, in extreme cold, the scope fogged. Iron sights had none of these problems. They required less elevation. They produced no glint. They did not fog. They were, Simo concluded, better. He was right. Between the 1st of December, 1939, and the 6th of March, 1940, a span of 98 days, Simo Häyhä recorded 505 confirmed kills with his rifle, and an estimated 200 additional kills with a Suomi KP-31 submachine gun during close-quarters engagements. The number is extraordinary. It averages to more than 5 kills per day every day for over 3 months, in conditions so extreme that simply surviving in the field was an achievement. No other sniper in recorded military history, not Vasily Zaitsev, not Chris Kyle, not Lyudmila Pavlichenko, has matched it. He operated alone, or in pairs with a spotter, moving through the forest on skis. He would select a position before dawn. A snowbank, a fallen tree, a fold in the ground, and dig in. He packed snow around his position to break up his silhouette. He put snow in his mouth to prevent his breath from producing a visible vapor cloud. He lay still. He waited. Some days he waited for hours and saw nothing. Some days the Soviet infantry advanced in lines across the frozen bogs, and he fired, reloaded until they withdrew. The Soviets noticed. They noticed very quickly. They sent counter-sniper teams. Simo killed them. They sent artillery. They would identify the general area of his position and call in concentrated mortar and artillery fire to blanket the forest. Simo moved. They carpet-bombed sections of forest where they believed he was operating. Simo moved again. He was not invincible. He was simply very good at the specific set of skills that his specific landscape required: patience, stillness, cold tolerance, marksmanship at medium range without optics, and an intimate knowledge of terrain that he had walked since childhood. The White Death was not a supernatural figure. He was a farmer who knew his forest. On the 6th of March, 1940, a Soviet soldier hit Simo Häyhä in the face with an explosive bullet. The round struck his lower left jaw, tore away half of his face. He fell into the snow. The men in his unit found him and carried him to the rear. He was unconscious. The field surgeons did what they could, which was not much. They stabilized him, stopped the bleeding, and evacuated him to a hospital further back. He was in a coma for 11 days. He woke up on the 13th of March, 1940, the day the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed, ending the Winter War. He had been unconscious for the last week of the war and for the first days of the peace. He woke to a Finland that was still independent but had lost the Karelian Isthmus, including Rotjärvi, his home, his farm, the forests he had defended. Under the terms of the treaty, the entire Karelian population was relocated west. Simo Häyhä never went home again. He spent the next year in hospitals. His face was rebuilt through multiple surgeries. The jaw was reconstructed. The damage was permanent. Photographs from after the war show a face visibly altered. The left side collapsed and scarred. He never spoke about it publicly. He did not return to combat. He was promoted to second lieutenant, a rank he had not held during the war, by direct order of Field Marshal Mannerheim, the Finnish commander-in-chief. He was given a specially engraved rifle as a personal gift from Mannerheim. He returned to farming. He bred dogs, Labradors mostly, and Finnish hounds. He hunted moose. He lived in a small house in Ruokolahti near the new border, in a landscape that resembled the one he had lost but was not quite the same. He did not talk about the war unless asked. When asked, he answered briefly. The most famous of his answers came from an interview late in his life, when a journalist asked him what he felt about having killed so many men. He said, "I did what I was told to do as well as I could." He was asked what had made him such a good marksman. He said, "Practice." He died on the 1st of April 2002. He was 96 years old. He was, at the time of his death, the holder of the highest confirmed sniper count in the history of warfare, a record that has not been surpassed. There is a small museum in Rotjärvi, which is now on the Russian side of the border, that contains some artifacts of the Karelian Finnish community that once lived there. Simo Häyhä's story is not prominently featured. The Finns, as a nation, do not celebrate individual war heroes the way some other countries do. The Winter War is remembered collectively, as a national survival, not a personal triumph. But in the forest above the Kala River, where the snow still falls in November and the temperature still drops to -40 in January, there is a granite memorial to the men of the Kala Front. The inscription reads, "Kala holds." It held because of many things: terrain, tactics, Finnish stubbornness, Soviet incompetence. It held because of logistics and luck and the accidents of geography. And it held, in part, because of a quiet farmer who lay in the snow for 3 months with iron sights and a bolt-action rifle, who did not use a scope because a scope produced a glint, who put snow in his mouth so his breath would not betray him, and who, when asked about all of it decades later, said only that he had done what he was told as well as he could. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week. Imagine a beach at dawn. Not the beach you know from photographs, the gray water and the steel obstacles and the landing craft grinding onto sand. Something earlier than that. The hour before the main assault. A single figure standing at the prow of a landing craft, silhouetted against the lightning sky, playing the bagpipes. Around him, shells are falling. The men crouching in the craft behind him are doing what men do when shells are falling, making themselves small, trying to disappear inside their helmets. And at the front of the boat, in full view, a British officer is playing a Scottish lament into the smoke and the noise and the approaching shore. His name was Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. His men called him Mad Jack. The Germans, who encountered him on multiple occasions and found each encounter more confusing than the last, had no name for him. They had simply never seen anything like him. He was carrying a Scottish broadsword that morning. He had been carrying it since 1940. He had also, at various points during the war, carried a longbow, a quiver of arrows, and the bagpipes currently announcing his arrival to the coast of occupied territory. This is not a story about madness. It is a story about a man who had decided, quietly and completely, that the only way to fight a war was to be entirely, relentlessly himself, and who turned out to be exactly what the moment required. John Churchill was born in 1906 into a British military family and educated at the Royal Military College, Sandhurst. He was, by temperament and training, a soldier. But between the wars, the British Army offered limited scope for men of his particular disposition, and he filled the gap in ways that tell you a great deal about what he was. He learned to play the bagpipes. Not casually, not as a curiosity, but seriously. He became good enough to compete at the British Open Pipe Band Championship. He took up the longbow at a time when the longbow had been obsolete for roughly 4 centuries. He practiced until he was competent at distances that would have been respectable in the 14th century. He also worked as a film extra, appeared in a crowd scene in a picture called The Thief of Baghdad, and spent a period living in East Africa where he rode a motorcycle and worked as a newspaper dispatch writer. He was not an eccentric in the drawing room sense, not a collector of odd things or an exhibitionist at dinner parties. He was an eccentric in the deeper, harder sense. A man whose understanding of what mattered was simply different from the standard model, and who had no particular interest in adjusting it to match. When the war began in September 1939, he was 33 years old and living in a world that had suddenly become exactly the kind of place he was equipped for. Churchill was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, Manchester Regiment, and deployed to France in 1939 as part of the British Expeditionary Force. He brought his longbow and his broadsword. His commanding officers apparently decided that these were his business and not theirs. In May 1940, during the fighting retreat to Dunkirk, Churchill's unit was engaged near the town of Lepanette. In the confusion of the fighting, Churchill spotted a German NCO, a non-commissioned officer, moving through a field at a range of approximately 180 yards. He drew his bow. He loosed an arrow. The German fell. It is, according to historians who have verified it, the only confirmed longbow kill in the Second World War. Possibly the only confirmed longbow kill in any war since the 16th century. Churchill noted it in his diary with characteristic understatement. It had been a reasonable shot, he felt. The range was not exceptional. He escaped from Dunkirk with the rest of the BEF and was returned to Britain. He was decorated, promoted, and assigned to the newly formed No. 3 Commando, one of the elite raiding units that Churchill had personally championed in the dark months of 1940 when offense against German-held Europe seemed like a distant fantasy. The commandos suited him. They were built around small unit operations, speed, surprise, and the willingness to operate under conditions that conventional forces could not. They needed men who were comfortable with ambiguity, with darkness, with the knowledge that help was probably not coming. Churchill was all of these things. In December 1941, Churchill led a raid on the Norwegian island of Vagsø, one of the first major commando raids of the war. The objective was to destroy German fish oil processing facilities, which were producing glycerin for explosives, and to disrupt the German garrison. Churchill prepared for the assault in the way that seemed natural to him. As the landing craft came in toward the shore, he stood at the bow with his broadsword buckled at his hip and his bagpipes in his hands, playing March of the Cameron Men, a traditional Scottish tune that carries both the melancholy of departure and the wildness of what comes after. He leaped off the craft first, threw a grenade into the doorway of the nearest building, and charged through the smoke with his sword drawn. The action at Vagsø lasted the better part of a day. The German garrison was dug in throughout the town and in the fish oil factories along the waterfront, and clearing them required block by block fighting in narrow streets against an enemy who knew the ground and had the high ground on the hillside above. Churchill led his troop through it with the sword in one hand and whatever else was required in the other, moving through doorways and alleys with the kind of forward momentum that is either training or temperament or some combination that becomes indistinguishable. The action at Vagsø was fierce and costly. The commandos achieved their objectives. Churchill led his section through alley-to-alley fighting with a combination of tactical competence and personal aggression that his men found simultaneously inspiring and deeply strange. He later described it as one of the most satisfying days of his life. He was awarded the Military Cross for Vagsø. He was also, by now, becoming something of a legend within the commandos, a figure who existed at the intersection of genuine effectiveness and something that functioned almost as theater. He understood, intuitively, something that military historians have spent decades trying to articulate, that in the moment of contact with the enemy, what matters is not just firepower but will. And will can be projected, can be performed. A man charging with a broadsword while playing bagpipes is sending a message to both his own men and to the enemy. And that message is, we are not afraid of you. Whether the Germans were confused or frightened or simply baffled is less important than the effect it had on the men following him. They followed. In 1943, Churchill was given command of 2 Commando and deployed to Yugoslavia, where he operated in support of Tito's partisan resistance movement. He conducted raids on German-held islands in the Adriatic with the same combination of meticulous preparation and personal daring that had characterized everything he did. He captured the German garrison of the island of Brac largely through the sustained aggressive pressure of a broadsword charge uphill toward a fortified position, an action that sounds impossible and apparently worked because no one, including the defending Germans, could quite believe it was happening. During this period in the Adriatic, Churchill also had what might have been his most improbably intimate encounter with the enemy. He captured a German soldier, alone at night using the broadsword, by approaching him silently from behind, touching the blade to his throat, and instructing him quietly in the few words of German Churchill possessed to be still. The soldier was still. Churchill marched him back to the partisan lines. He seemed pleased by the efficiency of the method. He saw no reason why a medieval weapon could not be operationally useful in a modern war. He had, after all, already proved it could be. In May 1944, during the partisan offensive, Churchill was caught in an ambush. His unit was surrounded by a German force and, after a series of firefights in which he continued to be aggressively, conspicuously armed, he was captured while playing the bagpipes. He was interrogated. He gave nothing useful. He was transferred to various prisoner-of-war camps, ending up at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, a facility not designed for ordinary prisoners of war, a sign that the Germans regarded him with a particular wariness they probably couldn't have explained if pressed. In September 1944, Churchill escaped from Sachsenhausen. He had studied the camp's routines and the guard rotation until he saw the window he needed. With a fellow officer, he went through it and out into the German countryside. They walked 150 miles south and east, moving at night through a country that was at war with everything they were, surviving on whatever they could find in fields and orchards, making for the Allied front. They walked for weeks. They were recaptured near the Austrian border, cold and exhausted and, by all accounts, not particularly demoralized. He was transferred again, this time to a camp in the Tyrol, where he and a group of other high-value prisoners, political figures, military officers, family members of those who had plotted against Hitler, were being held under SS guard. In April 1945, as the Allied advance into Germany accelerated, the SS guards fled. Churchill led the prisoners out of the camp on foot and found the nearest American unit. He was disappointed to learn that Germany had surrendered before he could get back into the war. He was not entirely joking. He reportedly said that the Americans had ruined what would have been a perfectly good war by dropping atomic bombs on Japan and ending that conflict too. He had hoped to be transferred to the Pacific Theater. After the war, he taught land-air warfare at the Australian Staff College, took up surfing in Sydney, and became one of the first people in Britain to ride a surfboard, a handmade board he had constructed himself, which he took to the tidal bores of the River Severn. He died in 1996, at 89. To the end, he remained precisely who he had always been. It is easy to look at Jack Churchill and see the comedy first, the longbow, the sword, the bagpipes, the series of encounters with German forces that reads like a fever dream of military improbability. It is easy to treat him as a character rather than a man. But the laughter, if you let yourself settle into this story, goes sideways somewhere. Because what he was doing underneath all of it was something serious. He was insisting on himself in the middle of a war that was trying very hard to reduce human beings to functions. Soldiers are trained to suppress the individual self in service of the unit, and this is necessary and correct. But Jack Churchill managed to maintain that individual self so completely, so stubbornly, that it became the unit's greatest asset. He said once, and this has been quoted often enough that it may have smoothed in the retelling, but it has the ring of authenticity. Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. What he meant was something more than the sword. He meant, be who you are. All the way to the shore. All the way up the hill. All the way to the end. The men who served with him, who are the most reliable witnesses we have, said uniformly that they would follow him anywhere. Not despite the bagpipes and the sword and the bow. Because of them. Because a man who is that entirely, completely himself in the face of everything the world is throwing at him is a man who has found the thing worth following. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week. On a road in the Lot Valley in southwestern France, in the summer of 1944, a German panzer column has stopped. There are perhaps 60 vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, supply trucks, a mobile kitchen. The column stretches for a mile along the narrow road. The commander, a colonel, is standing beside his lead tank. He has been presented with a problem he does not understand. In front of his column, standing alone in the middle of the road, is a British officer. The officer is wearing a kilt. He is wearing a Glengarry bonnet with a hackle feather. He has a revolver on his hip. He has no visible backup, no visible force, No visible anything except the kilt and a degree of personal composure that the German colonel finds deeply unsettling. The officer is telling the colonel, in fluent German, that an entire Allied division is positioned in the hills on either side of the road. He is telling the colonel that if the column moves 1 more meter forward, every gun in those hills will open fire. He is telling the colonel that surrender is the only rational option. There is no division in the hills. There are 11 men, French resistance fighters with rifles and a handful of grenades. The German colonel does not know this. The officer in the kilt is Captain Thomas Tommy Macpherson, of the 1st Special Air Service Regiment. He is 24 years old. And this is not even the most outrageous bluff he will pull this month. Thomas Macpherson was born on the 4th of October, 1920, in Edinburgh, into a family that had been Scottish longer than Scotland had been a country. His father was a solicitor. His mother was from the Highlands. The family was Church of Scotland, professional class, thoroughly conventional in every respect except one. They expected physical courage the way other families expected good table manners. Tommy was educated at Fettes College, then at Trinity College, Oxford, where he read jurisprudence. He was athletic. He rode. He boxed. He was, by every account, the kind of young man who was cheerful in a way that made the quiet people around him feel slightly nervous. In 1939, at 19, he left Oxford and was commissioned into the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. Within 2 years, he volunteered for the Commandos, then for the Special Air Service, the SAS, David Stirling's Desert Raiding Force, which at that point in the war was less than a year old and still viewed by the regular army as a collection of dangerous lunatics. He was sent to North Africa in early 1942. He was 21. His first operation behind enemy lines lasted less than a week. In June of 1942, he was part of a small SAS patrol dropped by parachute into the Libyan desert to raid an Axis airfield. The patrol was compromised almost immediately. They were captured by Italian forces and handed over to the Germans. Tommy was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Italy. He escaped. He was recaptured. He escaped again. He was recaptured again. He escaped a 3rd time, this time making it more than 100 miles south through the Italian countryside before being caught by a German patrol near the Swiss border. After the 3rd escape, the Germans sent him to a high-security camp in Germany. He was 22 years old, and he had spent more time escaping from prison camps than he had spent fighting the war. He was held for nearly 2 years. In early 1944, he was repatriated in a prisoner exchange, one of a small number of officers swapped through the Red Cross. He returned to Britain in the spring, underweight, restless, and ready. SOE and the SAS were looking for officers who spoke French and German, who knew how to operate behind enemy lines, and who were, in the clinical language of the selection reports, temperamentally suited to independent action in hostile territory. Tommy Macpherson spoke French fluently, spoke German well enough to argue with a colonel, had already escaped from 3 prison camps, and possessed a temperament that could most accurately be described as cheerfully unhinged. They sent him back to France. On the night of the 8th of June, 1944, 2 days after D-Day, Tommy Macpherson parachuted into the Lot Department of southwestern France. He was wearing, as he would later write with evident satisfaction, his full Highland dress, the kilt, the Glengarry, the Cameron Highlanders badge. He carried a revolver, a knife, a radio, and a set of orders that told him to organize local resistance forces, disrupt German communications, and delay any German reinforcement heading north toward Normandy. His team was 3 men, himself, a French officer, and a radio operator. The Lot was occupied territory. The nearest Allied forces were 500 miles to the north, fighting their way off the beaches. The German garrison in the region was the Das Reich Division, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, one of the most feared armored units in the German army, which had received orders to move north to Normandy as quickly as possible. Tommy's job was to slow them down. He did this primarily by lying. The technique was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Tommy would approach a German unit, sometimes at a roadblock, sometimes by walking into their camp, sometimes by standing in the middle of a road, and inform them in German that they were surrounded by a vastly superior force. He would describe the force in specific military detail. He would name regiments. He would cite unit numbers. He would produce, from inside his tunic, printed orders that appeared to bear the seal of Allied command. The orders were forged. The regiments did not exist. The force was, in most cases, a few dozen lightly armed resistance fighters hiding in the woods. But Tommy Macpherson wore a kilt. He spoke with the absolute authority of a man who had been to Oxford and who believed, on a molecular level, that a British officer's word was not to be questioned. He was calm. He was precise. He was unfailingly polite. And the Germans, disoriented by the invasion, cut off from reliable communication, bombarded by false radio traffic and sabotaged telephone lines, could not tell the difference between a bluff and a division. Over the next 2 months, he and his team, which grew to include several hundred resistance fighters, disrupted German operations across an area of roughly 4,000 square kilometers. He bluffed a company of German infantry into surrendering their weapons at a crossroad near Figeac. He persuaded a garrison commander in Cahors to negotiate a withdrawal rather than fight. He organized the demolition of bridges and rail lines across the Lot Valley. And then came the Panzer Column. The column was part of a German force moving south, away from Normandy, trying to reach the Spanish border or the Mediterranean coast before the Allies cut them off. It was a substantial force, tanks, armored vehicles, several thousand men. Tommy met them on the road. He stood in the middle of it, in his kilt, alone. He told the colonel that the hills were full of Allied troops. He described their positions. He described their artillery. He described, in considerable detail, the exact number of anti-tank guns trained on the road. There were no anti-tank guns. There were 11 men with rifles. The colonel hesitated. He looked at the hills. The hills were silent. The silence, as Tommy well knew, could mean anything. Could mean empty woods. Could mean 1,000 men waiting. The colonel asked for time to consult with his superior by radio. Tommy told him he had 30 minutes. If the column had not surrendered in 30 minutes, he said, the guns would open fire. The colonel surrendered. 23,000 German soldiers in the region laid down their weapons in the days that followed, not all because of Tommy Macpherson, but in a cascading collapse of morale that his operations had done as much as anything to create. The myth of overwhelming Allied strength in the hills of the Lot had, through sheer repetition and audacity, become indistinguishable from fact. By the end of the war, Tommy Macpherson held the Military Cross with 2 bars, 3 military crosses in total, the Croix de Guerre, the Légion d'honneur, and a Distinguished Service Order. He is widely considered the most decorated British soldier of the Second World War, though the precise ranking depends on which decorations one counts. He went back to law. He became a solicitor, then a businessman. He ran a Scottish investment trust. He served as chairman of a whiskey company. He lived in Perthshire, in a house that looked out over the hills he had once pretended were full of soldiers. He did not talk much about the war. When he did, it was with a dryness that bordered on understatement. He wrote a memoir in 2010, at the age of 90, titled Behind Enemy Lines. It is a remarkably modest book for a man who bluffed a panzer column into surrender while wearing a kilt. He was asked, late in life, what had made the bluffs work, why the Germans had believed him when the evidence behind him was so thin. He thought about it. Then he said, I think they looked at me in a kilt, standing alone in the road, and they thought, no one would do this unless it were true. He died on the 6th of November, 2014. He was 94 years old. There is a lesson in Tommy Macpherson that the military manuals have never quite captured, because it does not translate well into doctrine. He won his war not with firepower, not with numbers, not with technology. He won it with theater, with the understanding that in the fog of war, perception is reality, and a man standing alone in a road wearing a kilt and speaking with absolute conviction is, to a frightened colonel who cannot see the hills behind him, indistinguishable from a division. The kilt is in a museum now. The hills above the lot are quiet. The road where the panzers stopped is a country lane, lined with plane trees, where farmers drive their tractors to market on Saturday mornings. No plaque marks the spot. There is only the road, and the silence, and the memory of a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a war is the willingness to stand where no one expects you to stand and say, with perfect calm, something that is not true. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week.